In the winter of 1847, the Mississippi Delta looked almost beautiful if you were standing in the right place and were the right color. From the veranda of Thornwood Plantation's big house, the land rolled out in a white ocean. Cotton plants stripped down for picking, fields stretching flat and endless to the horizon. The December air was cold enough to sting the nose, the sky high and thin and pale. You could almost pretend it was peaceful. You had to ignore the 200 people who made that peace possible. Thornwood covered 1,500 acres of rich delta soil. On maps, it was just a block of land in Yazoo County, Mississippi. In reality, it was a machine built to grind human beings down into money. Every acre, every cotton row, every brick in the big house had been bought with stolen labor and broken bodies. At the center of it all stood Master Edmund Thornwood. He was 62 that year, tall and lean, with iron-gray hair combed straight back from a high brow. His eyes were a washed-out blue, cold and flat, like river ice. When he walked, he carried himself with the quiet assurance of a man who had never heard the word no and expected never to hear it in his lifetime. The enslaved people at Thornwood had another name for him, the Iron Master, not because he was particularly strong, though he was not weak. The name came from the thing mounted on the wall of his study, a branding iron with his initials, E.T., curved into metal. By 1847, Edmund Thornwood had pressed that iron into 89 human bodies, men, women, children as young as 10, shoulders, arms, backs, faces when he wanted the mark to be visible every time the victim looked into water or polished metal. The iron hung above his desk like a hunting trophy. When discipline was needed, and in Edmund's mind discipline was always needed, he would take it down himself. He liked the ritual. Heat the iron in the fireplace until it glowed dull red. Let the room fill with the hot metal smell. Then press it into brown skin while the overseers held the victim down. The scream always came at the same moment. He knew it so well he could have timed it with a clock. Around the big house, people got used to the smell of scorched flesh drifting out of the study. At Thornwood, that smell sat in the air the way coffee did in other homes. Edmund had 3 sons, and if anything survived of his conscience, it had not reached them. Nathaniel, the eldest at 35, was built like a bull and had his father's cold blue eyes. He ran the fields and the picking crews. Nathaniel believed in numbers, bale counts, quotas, lash totals. He had devised a system that made other planters in Yazoo County nod with respect and something like envy. 200 pounds of cotton per person per day, that was the number. It didn't matter if the picker was 18 or 60, male or female, sick or pregnant. If the sack weighed less than 200 pounds at sundown, the person who carried it was tied to the post and given 20 lashes. There were no exceptions. In a good week, Nathaniel whipped 30 people. He kept track, not because he was ashamed, but because he liked to compare one week to the next. Progress, efficiency, improvement. Sometimes at Sunday dinner, he would brag about a particularly stubborn man or a crying girl who finally learned their lesson after the 12th or 13th stroke. His father would listen, sip his bourbon, and nod with approval. Jeremiah, the middle son at 32, was leaner, with dark hair and a thin mustache he trimmed carefully every morning. Where Nathaniel was blunt, Jeremiah was surgical. He oversaw the cotton gin, the presses, the loading operations, every step between field and riverboat. The huge iron teeth and belts, the spinning drums and belts fascinated him. So did what happened when flesh got in the way. Hands slipped, sleeves caught, fingers vanished between rollers. Everyone else flinched. Jeremiah watched. He carried a small leather-bound notebook in his coat. When someone screamed, he took it out. When someone fainted, he checked the time on his pocket watch and wrote. He called it Scientific Observation of Negro Pain Tolerance. In 5 years, 7 people had died in accidents under his watch. He called them data. Caleb, the youngest at 28, had inherited none of his father's hardness of face. He was almost handsome, with blonde hair like his dead mother's, and a smile that made the visiting planters' daughters giggle behind their fans. He managed the house slaves, cooks, maids, stable boys, laundry women. To guests he was charming, attentive, quick with a joke. To the enslaved girls between 14 and 20, he was something else entirely. His private cabin sat behind the big house, a little too nice for a simple overseer, tucked just out of sight. At night, certain girls were sent to help him. Sometimes they came back silent and hollow-eyed. Sometimes they did not come back at all. Once, when asked about a 16-year-old girl who'd vanished, Caleb shrugged and poured himself another drink. "Probably ran," he said. "They do that." 3 months later, her body turned up in a shallow grave near the gin, half uncovered by rain. Nobody asked Caleb about runaways after that. The 3 Thornwood men competed like boys who'd grown up in a house without rules. Hunting stories, poker games, cruelty. Each Sunday when the big house table was laid out, china from England, silver from New Orleans, roast from Maria's kitchen, they swapped stories. How many lashings given? How many pounds of cotton forced from exhausted hands? How long today's example lasted before fainting? The slaves had their own competitions in whispers. Which brother was worse? Which punishment would be chosen next? Whether dying quickly was luck or a curse, this was the world Maria cooked for. The big house itself rose 3 stories above the fields, white columns gleaming in the brutal sun. Magnolia trees shadowed the drive. A wide veranda wrapped all the way around, catching every faint breeze that moved through the heavy air. Inside were crystal chandeliers from France, carpets shipped from Persia, mahogany furniture from England, paintings in gilded frames, heavy drapes to shut out the heat. None of it had ever been touched by Edmund's hands in any real way. The cotton bought it. The cotton that Maria and her people planted, weeded, picked, ginned, pressed and loaded. The cotton pulled from stems by fingers that bled until the skin simply stopped splitting because it had nothing left to give. The only building on the property that truly belonged to Maria was the kitchen. It was a separate brick house behind the big house, connected by a covered walkway. The walls were thick to keep in the heat from the great ovens and fireplaces. Iron hooks lined the beams. Shelves sagged under the weight of pots, pans, spices, sacks of flour and cornmeal, and there were the cauldrons, 4 of them, each a black iron belly big enough to hold 30 gallons of liquid. They were used for everything: boiling water for laundry, rendering lard from pig fat, making soap, and most of all, deep-frying food the Thornwoods craved. Maria had learned exactly how long it took to bring pork oil from cold and solid to a clear, shimmering 375 degrees. She knew the sound it made when it reached the right heat, the way it thickened, the way it hissed when raw meat went in and came out golden and crisp. She knew those cauldrons better than she knew her own face. To the Thornwood family, Maria was almost invisible. She was 38 that winter, medium height, strong shoulders from lifting heavy pots, hands calloused from knives, flour and fire. Her face was calm, controlled. She had learned a long time ago that the safest expression was none at all. 10 minutes before dawn, she would be in the kitchen, stoking fires, kneading dough, stirring grits. By 7, breakfast appeared on the big house table. Biscuits, ham, eggs, gravy, coffee. She moved around the dining room silent and precise, keeping her eyes lowered as plates were passed. Criticism offered, praise occasionally thrown like scraps. Excellent biscuits. "Maria, yes, master. More coffee." "Maria, yes, master." Then back to the kitchen. Clear the dishes, scrub, start lunch. She had keys to every pantry, every storage room. She alone knew where every spice jar sat, which barrel held the best lard, which sacks of flour were freshest. In 12 years at Thornwood, she had never given her master a reason to doubt her. To him she was perfect, skilled, obedient, silent. To the other enslaved people, she was more than that. Maria had not been born in Mississippi or in slavery, or even in America. Her first name was not Maria. It had been taken from her like everything else. She had come into the world as Iomide in Yoruba land on the far side of the ocean, in a village whose name she barely remembered. Her mother had told her once that the name meant, "My joy has arrived." That joy had lasted about 12 years. She remembered flashes, her mother's singing, the rhythm of drums at night, red earth between bare toes, the bitter sweetness of palm wine on her tongue when the adults weren't looking. Then the slavers came, chains, torches, smoke, a march to the coast. The Middle Passage had taken 11 weeks. She remembered the darkness of the ship's hold, the stench, the groans, the feel of bodies packed so close you could not turn without bumping another rib cage. She remembered a Portuguese voice shouting her new name and a hand slapping her when she failed to respond fast enough. When the ship finally spewed her and the others into Charleston in 1821, The girl who had been Aomide spoke no English and understood only that her world had ended. On the South Carolina rice plantation where she was first sold, an older enslaved woman named Abigail took pity on the silent African girl who cried every night. Abigail had been taken from Africa too, from a different people, but she remembered more. She taught the child words, first in English, then piece by piece in their broken, mismatched African tongues. More importantly, Abigail taught her things that had nothing to do with cooking or cleaning, which roots soothed fever, which leaves could bring sleep, which berries stopped a heart. Never forget what they took from us, Abigail would whisper when no overseer was near. Never forget you are Yoruba. You are not their property. You are a daughter of Africa. One day the ancestors will ask for payment for all this. Maria listened. She nodded, and she remembered. In the years that followed, she was sold like furniture across 3 states, South Carolina to Georgia, Georgia to Alabama, Alabama to Mississippi. They changed her name again along the way. Eventually, Aomide disappeared from the bills of sale, and Maria appeared in its place. By the time Edmund Thornwood bought her at age 26, she was an accomplished cook. She could make French sauces and English roasts, rice dishes and stews. She knew how to use spice to hide bad meat, how to stretch flour so the bread looked richer than it was. Edmund bought her for exactly that. He wanted a cook who could make his table match his ambitions. Thornwood became her last stop. For 12 years, she built a narrow, fragile life in the cracks of that place. In 1835, a few months after arriving, she stood in the slave quarters, under a low Mississippi sky with a handful of witnesses, while an old preacher named Moses mumbled blessings over her, and a man named Isaiah was the plantation blacksmith, a powerful man in his early 30s with arms like iron and burn scars up and down his hands. He walked with the heavy, deliberate gait of someone who had spent a lifetime beating metal into shape and understood force. He could read, a dangerous skill for a slave. A girl in some long-ago owner's house had secretly taught him letters. The memory of that kindness had not yet been beaten out of him. He and Maria were not married in the eyes of Mississippi law. Slaves could not marry, but everyone in the quarters treated them as husband and wife. They made a home in a one-room cabin, barely big enough for the 4 rough boards that formed their bed, a trunk, a shelf, and a small hearth. The floor was dirt, pressed hard by many feet. The walls leaked wind in winter, and mosquitoes in summer. Still, it was theirs. At night, when the forge fires cooled and the kitchen quieted, Maria and Isaiah would stretch out on that bed, muscles sore from the day, and talk in low voices. Up north, they say there are places where we're free, Isaiah would murmur, staring into the darkness. Places where a black man can walk and not have a master. Canada, he'd say the word slowly like it was some kind of spell. A railroad that isn't a railroad. People who hide you in their homes, move you from house to house, all the way up to where the law can't touch you. Maria would listen, heart aching with a hope she barely dared to feel. One day we'll run, he'd whisper into her hair. I'll get us there. You, me, and the girls. She wanted to believe him. Some nights she did. Some nights she didn't. Their first daughter, Grace, was born later that same year. Maria labored on the dirt floor, while Isaiah held her hand and tried to remember the names of gods he'd half forgotten from childhood, and saints he'd been forced to hear about in white men's churches. When that tiny, perfect child finally wailed her way into the cabin air, Maria's first instinct was not joy. It was terror. She knew exactly what world her daughter had been born into. On paper, Grace belonged to Edmund Thornwood from her first breath to her last. 4 years later, their second daughter arrived. Hope, another piece of Maria's heart, walking around outside her body. Another child born into a system that treated human beings as tools and collateral. Grace grew into a quick, bright girl who loved to be in the kitchen, watching her mother work, mimicking her movements with toy pots and imaginary ingredients. At 8, she could knead dough and season stews better than some grown women. Hope was quieter, watching people closely, listening hard to stories the elders told in the dim evenings, stories of Africa, whispered memories of villages and rivers on the other side of the ocean. Both girls were pretty in a way that made Maria sick with fear. She knew what happened to pretty enslaved girls when they reached a certain age, and a certain master's son decided to take an interest. Still, in the tiny gaps allowed to them, Sunday gatherings, stolen laughter in the quarters, songs hummed under breath, they managed to build something that almost resembled a life. They had no way of knowing how little time was left. By September 1847, Isaiah was 42, Maria 38, Grace 12, Hope 8. The fields were thick with cotton, white bowls bursting open. The picking season was in full swing. The price of cotton was good. The iron master was pleased. The machine of Thornwood churned along, whips cracking, iron pounding, cauldrons bubbling, hearts breaking. No one in the quarters knew that they had exactly 3 months left as a family. And on the morning of September 18, 1847, Maria woke before dawn, reached quietly for Isaiah in the dark, and felt his warmth for the last time, without knowing it was the last time. By dawn, Maria was already awake. She moved through the kitchen by habit, stoking the embers, feeding the fire, kneading dough until her arms burned. The smell of yeast and wood smoke mixed in the air, comforting and heavy. It was September 18, 1847. The day began like any other, long, hot, endless. Yet something in the air felt tight, a kind of pressure that Maria couldn't name. Grace had been in the kitchen since sunrise, her braids tied back, her hands white with flour. Hope sat by the door, shelling beans into a wooden bowl, humming under her breath. Isaiah had gone to the forge before dawn, carrying the heavy calm that always came over him before a hard day. The plantation stirred around them, field hands moving toward the rows, overseers barking orders, the rhythmic slap of bare feet on packed earth. From the big house, the first voice that broke the morning quiet was Nathaniel's. "Maria, breakfast." She wiped her hands, adjusted her head wrap, and went. Inside the big house, the Thornwood men were already at the table, Edmund with his newspaper, Nathaniel and Jeremiah arguing about output numbers, and Caleb pouring whiskey into his coffee. Maria laid out the dishes, ham steaks, grits, biscuits, gravy, eggs, preserves. She didn't speak. She never did unless spoken to. "Maria," Edmund said, not looking up from the paper. "The new boy in the south field. Whip him again today, 10 more. He's still not hitting quota." "Yes, master." "Tell Isaiah to sharpen the plough blades before noon," Nathaniel added. "He was slow yesterday." "Yes, master." She nodded, eyes lowered, heart tight. She left quietly, the sound of male laughter echoing behind her. Back in the kitchen, she could hear the forge hammer ringing in the distance. Clang, 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 steady, sure, Isaiah's rhythm. She smiled faintly. That sound meant he was still alive, still fighting the only way he could, by working, by enduring. By mid-morning, the sun was a white coin over the fields, heat flattening everything. Sweat soaked through shirts before breakfast had cooled. The day dragged, then came the shout, "Maria!" It was Caleb's voice, sharp and urgent, from the direction of the smokehouse. When she reached him, he was standing by the door, holding a musket and looking furious. Behind him, the white overseer, Harlan, was dragging a boy by the collar, a field hand no older than 16. The boy's eyes were wild with fear. "This little thief," Caleb sneered, "was sneaking sugar from the kitchen. I caught him red-handed." Maria's heart dropped. Sugar was rationed tightly, locked in her pantry. She was the only one with the key. "I ain't steal nothing," the boy gasped. "I swear." Caleb hit him across the mouth with the butt of his musket. Blood spattered the dirt. "Lying too," Caleb said, smiling thinly. "Search the kitchen." She didn't move. "Now, Maria." She turned and walked slowly back to the kitchen, feeling the eyes of every servant and field hand nearby. When Caleb and Harlan followed her in, she knew she was walking into a trap. They searched everything, the cupboards, the sacks, the barrels, and then Harlan gave a low whistle. "Looky here." He pulled a small pouch from behind the flour sacks. Inside, wrapped in paper, was a handful of stolen silver coins and a ring, Edmund Thornwood's ring. Caleb looked at her with mock surprise. "Well now, I didn't expect this from you, Maria." She said nothing. Her pulse pounded in her ears. "I don't know how that got there," she managed. "Of course you don't," Caleb said. "You think we're fools?" Within an hour, Edmund Thornwood was in the kitchen, eyes blazing, voice like thunder. "Stealing from me, Maria? After all I've given you." She knelt on the floor, trembling, staring at the hem of his coat. "I didn't, master. I swear on my children. Enough." Nathaniel grabbed her by the arm and yanked her to her feet. "She's lying." Always said the African ones couldn't be trusted. Jeremiah smiled faintly. Let's see what her husband has to say. They dragged Isaiah from the forge, still covered in soot, still gripping his hammer. He saw Maria's face pale and shaking and understood immediately. Master, she didn't steal, he said, breath hard. She don't even go near that room without me. Somebody planted that, Caleb smirked. So you're calling your betters liars? Isaiah looked him dead in the eye. I'm saying the devil lives in this house and his name ain't mine. The silence that followed was heavy and electric. Nathaniel's face went dark. Tie him. No, Maria cried, but two overseers grabbed Isaiah, forcing him to his knees. He struggled once, twice, then went still. Edmund Thornwood stepped forward, his voice calm. Isaiah, for speaking to me that way, you'll be whipped for insolence. For defending a thief, you'll hang at sundown. The woman, he looked at Maria, almost bored. She'll be dealt with after, Maria screamed. Grace and Hope ran from the quarters, crying for their father. By dusk, the whole plantation was gathered by the oak near the forge. Isaiah stood on a barrel, rope around his neck, hands bound. His eyes found Maria's in the crowd. Keep your head up, he said quietly. They can't take what's in your mind. The barrel kicked away. The sound of the rope creaking filled the air. Maria didn't cry. Not then. She stood frozen, her daughters clinging to her skirt, her heart gone cold as stone. That night she sat by the dying fire in the kitchen, staring at her hands. They trembled not from fear but from something deeper, something old and patient. The ironmaster had taken everything, but he had made one mistake. He had left her alive. The morning after Isaiah's hanging was the quietest Thornwood had ever been. The forge sat cold, the anvil untouched. The air carried the smell of burnt rope and something worse, shame that no one dared to speak aloud. Maria hadn't moved from the kitchen hearth since dawn. Her daughters lay against her knees, half asleep from crying. Grace's face was swollen. Hope's eyes were empty, too old for 8 years. Maria's hands were steady now, her tears long gone. Grief had burned clean through her and left only one thing: focus. The ironmaster had not spoken to her since the execution. That morning, Nathaniel came to the kitchen door with his riding crop in hand. Get up, he said flatly. Father says you'll keep working. Dinner's expected as usual. She looked up at him. Yes, master. The words came out calm, almost gentle. Inside, something shifted. By noon, she was in the smokehouse again, surrounded by the familiar smell of salt, fat, and hickory. Every knife, every cauldron, every hook, she knew them all like friends. She moved through her duties with the precision of a machine. Grace and Hope tried to help, but Maria sent them to the quarters. Go, stay quiet. Don't come near the big house. Her voice had no softness left. The girls obeyed. At sundown, the Thornwoods sat for supper as if nothing had happened. Edmund read aloud from the newspaper between bites of roasted duck. Jeremiah commented on cotton prices. Caleb made a joke about the new widow in the kitchen. Nathaniel laughed. Maria moved between table and hearth like a shadow, serving them silently, her face blank. When the meal ended, Edmund pushed his chair back and stood. Maria, he said, tomorrow you'll clean the forge. Burn what's left of that man's tools. I won't have his filth lingering here. Yes, master. That night she did not sleep. She sat alone in the kitchen, staring into the fire. When the embers dimmed, she fed them again. By the time dawn came, she had made her decision. She went to the quarters, kissed her daughters' foreheads, and told them a lie. Everything's going to be all right. Mama just needs to work a little longer. Then she walked back toward the kitchen, head high. For 3 months she worked like a ghost, silent, obedient, precise. She smiled when Caleb made jokes, bowed when Edmund barked orders. She cooked their meals, cleaned their plates, folded their linens. But at night she studied. She watched where they kept their brandy. She noted which cupboard Caleb forgot to lock. She remembered every herb Abigail had ever taught her, every root that could numb or kill. She began collecting quietly. Bits of bitter cassava, ground oleander, foxglove seeds stolen from Jeremiah's garden, and a powder she made from boiled peach leaves. She hid them in a hollow behind the kitchen bricks, where only she could reach. And every night she whispered to the fire in Yoruba. Words her mother had spoken long ago, words of the old gods, the ones who remembered justice when men forgot it. The other slaves noticed something in her eyes, something colder than grief. They whispered about her in the quarters. Some said madness had taken her. Others said the ancestors had. They were both right. By the second week of December, Maria had tested her mixture on rats in the kitchen cellar. It worked cleanly. Paralysis first, then a slow fade into stillness. She adjusted the doses until she was certain Christmas Eve was coming. The Thornwoods always demanded a feast then, an obscene display of food and drink. While the quarters starved on cornmeal and scraps, Maria planned every detail with the precision of a general preparing for war. The gingerbread was her weapon. It was a tradition she had introduced herself years earlier, a recipe from a Georgia plantation she'd once worked on. Spiced, rich and soft. The Thornwoods adored it. This time she baked it with care, smiling faintly as the smell of molasses filled the air. She mixed the poison into the dough with a wooden spoon, stirring until it disappeared into the sweetness. She made 4 small loaves, one for each of the men. By the time the sun set on December 24, 1847, the kitchen smelled like heaven. Candles glowed in the big house windows. Laughter echoed down the hall. Caleb's voice sang drunken carols. Maria carried the gingerbread to the dining table herself. "Merry Christmas, Master," she said softly, setting the loaves before them. Edmund raised a glass. "To Thornwood. To prosperity." The others echoed the toast. They ate, they laughed, they drank. Maria stood at the door watching. Within half an hour the first cough came from Jeremiah. He blinked, confused, a hand on his throat. Nathaniel laughed. "Swallowed wrong, brother?" Then Edmund's knife slipped from his hand. Caleb's smile froze halfway through a joke. One by one they stiffened, their limbs jerking, their mouths open in silent shock. Maria stepped forward, face unreadable. "Don't worry," she said quietly. "You'll sleep soon." When the first one fell, she turned and walked back toward the kitchen. The cauldrons were already hot. The lard shimmered, boiling, alive. Outside, the plantation was silent. Inside, the day of the cauldrons had begun. By morning, the Thornwood estate smelled of cooked fat and ash. The frost that usually dusted the fields on Christmas had melted under the smoke rolling from the kitchen house. No one entered. The other servants huddled near the quarters, whispering prayers, holding their children tight. They had heard the screams the night before, 4 voices that started as men and ended as something else. Then silence. When the sun came up, the overseer Harlan was the first to go looking. He walked toward the big house, musket ready, sweat freezing on his neck despite the cold. What he found stopped him dead in the doorway of the kitchen. The 4 Thornwood men, Edmund, Nathaniel, Jeremiah, and Caleb, lay sprawled on the floor. Their skin blistered, their faces twisted in expressions that no man could name. The iron cauldron still hissed beside them, full of what had once been lard and was now something darker. Maria sat in the corner chair, her apron soaked, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her head was tilted back against the wall, eyes half closed, face serene. For the first time in 12 years, she looked free. A broken bottle of laudanum lay beside her, half empty. No one touched her for a long time. Harlan finally sent for the sheriff, who came with a wagon and 3 deputies. They didn't bother asking what had happened. It was written across every surface. Word spread fast. By sundown, the nearest plantations had sent riders. By morning, the Yazoo County Sheriff stood in the big house parlor, hat in hand, speaking to no one in particular. "Never seen anything like it," he muttered. "God Almighty." He ordered the Thornwood men buried behind the house in a single fenced plot, for decency's sake. The graves were marked with plain wooden boards. E.T., N.T.J.T., C.T. Maria was buried apart, at the edge of the cotton fields, where the ground was shallow and the dirt poor. No marker, no ceremony. But that night, after the whites were gone, the people from the quarters came. They carried lanterns wrapped in cloth to hide the light, and they brought her daughters, Grace and Hope, who walked silently, holding each other's hands. Old Moses, the preacher, dug a small cross into the earth above her. He spoke low, his voice shaking. "She done what none of us could." An older woman, Isaiah's cousin, placed a handful of forge ashes at the base of the cross. "For him," she whispered. Then Grace stepped forward. Her face was still streaked with tears, but her voice didn't tremble. "Mama said the Lord sees everything," she said. Now he saw this too. When they left, the fireflies were thick in the grass, blinking like tiny spirits. The wind coming off the delta was warm for winter. carrying the faint smell of smoke and gingerbread. In the days that followed, the plantation dissolved. The county seized Thornwood as property without heirs. The remaining slaves were sold off to neighboring estates. Grace and Hope were separated, one sent east, one west, but they carried the story with them. It moved from mouth to mouth, plantation to plantation, whispered like scripture and cursed both. The cook who boiled her masters in their own grease. White men tried to erase it. They called it hysteria, rumor, the ravings of superstitious Negroes, but the tale didn't die. It spread in secret, reshaped by every tongue that told it. In time, people forgot the name Thornwood but remembered the woman. They called her the Iron Cook, Mama Fire, the Yoruba widow. And somewhere, in the places where the enslaved still dared to hope for freedom, her name became a quiet kind of prayer. 3 graves for the dead, 1 unmarked for the living memory. Maria's vengeance was complete. Her body lay cold in Mississippi clay, but her story had only just begun. Winter deepened, and the world around Thornwood sagged under cold rain and decay. By the end of December, the cotton fields were bare, the river slow and thick with mud. The plantation's glory had rotted in a single night. But the roots of what Maria did stretched back months, maybe years. The white men who came after her death, the sheriff, the doctor, the preacher, called it madness. They couldn't imagine calculation behind a slave woman's vengeance. They told themselves she snapped, that grief drove her to violence. They were wrong. Maria had built her revenge with the same patience she used to perfect a recipe. Every ingredient, every step measured and deliberate. After Isaiah's execution in September, she began by observing the rhythm of Thornwood itself. She memorized the way the men moved, what time they rose, when they drank, when they grew careless. She studied not only their habits but their appetites, their greed, their lust, their vanity. She knew Edmund Thornwood never ate sweets except on holidays. Nathaniel devoured anything fried in lard. Jeremiah tasted everything in the kitchen, out of arrogance. Caleb would eat anything Maria made with sugar, because he believed she did it to please him. They had all made themselves predictable, and Maria had turned that predictability into her weapon. She began her preparations by reclaiming the one domain she fully controlled, the kitchen. First came the ingredients. She took scraps of bitter cassava root from the garden, crushed peach leaves when no one was watching, dried foxglove flowers, and ground oleander seeds into fine dust. Each alone was dangerous. Together they were certain death, but raw poison wouldn't do. The Thornwoods needed to taste nothing but trust. So Maria disguised her creation in sweetness. Molasses thick enough to mask bitterness, ginger to confuse the nose, cinnamon to warm the tongue. She tested ratios on rats she trapped behind the smokehouse. Too strong, and they convulsed immediately. Too quick, too loud. Too weak, and they lived. She adjusted until the poison paralyzed cleanly before the heart gave out. She needed time. She needed them aware. The recipe evolved into something terrible and exact. 3 spoons of molasses for each spoon of lard, a pinch of clove to hide the bitter note, 2 drops of oleander oil to open the veins, powdered cassava to finish the heart. She wrote none of this down. It lived only in her mind, passed from thought to thought like a psalm. Each night she whispered to the flames, invoking Ogun, the iron god who watched over her husband's forge, who ruled justice through metal and blood. Ogun, she would murmur in Yoruba, they took what was yours. Let me return it. The fire cracked in answer. By early December, the kitchen's lard cauldrons, those massive black-bellied beasts, were polished until they gleamed. She told Harlan, the overseer, that she wanted them ready for the Christmas feast. He had nodded, unsuspecting. Meanwhile, she gathered small pieces of herself back together, her daughter's hair ribbons, Isaiah's hammer, a scrap of their wedding cloth. She hid them in a clay jar beneath the kitchen hearth. It was her altar, her promise. On the 23rd, she baked the test loaf, one she would never serve. She cut a small piece, placed it on a plate, and watched a stray rat eat it. It struggled for seconds, then fell still. The silence after its death felt like music. She crossed herself in the Christian way she'd been forced to learn, then touched her forehead in the old Yoruba sign for balance. Both gods will understand, she said quietly. The day before Christmas, the Thornwoods rode into town for church and supplies. Maria stayed behind, claiming she needed to prepare the feast. Alone in the kitchen, she hummed softly while she worked. The hymn was neither Christian nor African, but something between, a sound that belonged only to her. She baked 4 loaves that day, each one labeled in her mind Edmund, Nathaniel, Jeremiah, Caleb. She glazed them with molasses so dark it looked like lacquer. She sprinkled crushed ginger for fragrance. When she was done, they were perfect, golden, aromatic, innocent. That night she sat by the fire and whispered her final prayer. If the Lord will not see justice done, then I will. If the devil comes to claim me for it, I'll go singing. Outside, the first snow of that winter began to fall, rare, silent, and slow. Maria smiled at it, because by then, everything was ready. Christmas Eve, 1847. Thornwood Plantation glowed like a lantern against the cold, the big house windows flickering gold behind frost. Inside, garlands hung across the banisters, candles burned in silver holders, and the scent of roasted meat, wine, and baked gingerbread filled the air. To anyone passing on the road, it looked like wealth and peace. Inside, it was a grave waiting to be sealed. Maria had been in the kitchen since before dawn. The ovens roared. The cauldrons simmered with lard so hot, the air shimmered above them. Her hands worked without tremor as she basted the roast, set the table, poured the wine. She wore her cleanest apron, white and stiff with starch. Her daughters had been sent to the quarters early that morning. She told them gently, "Go play with the others. Stay until morning." They had protested, frightened by her tone, but she smiled and kissed their foreheads until they went. She didn't say goodbye. By evening, the 4 Thornwood men assembled in the dining room. Edmund stood at the head of the table, wearing his best black coat. Nathaniel was already drunk. Jeremiah was reading aloud from a letter about cotton prices. Caleb lounged with his boots on the chair, flirting lazily with the housemaid. Maria brought in the platters herself. Roasted duck, cornbread, fried okra, sweet potatoes with molasses. Each dish gleamed with oil and perfection. Caleb grinned at her. "You outdid yourself, Maria. Maybe Christmas ain't cursed after all," she smiled faintly. "Thank you, master." She poured the wine. She set the gingerbread loaves down last, one before each of them, warm, fragrant, golden. Edmund raised his glass. "To Thornwood, to our family, to profit," Jeremiah added, smirking. "To survival," Nathaniel muttered, already cutting his slice. Caleb winked at Maria. "To our cook." They drank. They ate. For a moment the world was quiet. Only the sound of forks against porcelain, the crackle of the hearth, and Maria's own heartbeat in her ears. Then Jeremiah coughed. It was small at first, a tickle, a dry rasp. Nathaniel laughed at him. "Slow down, brother." But then Nathaniel's own fork slipped from his hand. He frowned, confused. "What in—" His jaw locked. Edmund looked up sharply, eyes narrowing. His glass fell, spilling red across the tablecloth like blood. Caleb tried to stand, but his legs gave way. He hit the floor, gasping, his voice a strangled noise that wasn't quite a scream. Maria didn't move. She watched, hands folded before her. Jeremiah's face twisted, veins rising beneath his skin. Nathaniel tried to reach for his pistol, but his arm wouldn't obey. Edmund gritted his teeth, forcing words through his locked jaw. What have you done?" Maria tilted her head. "Only what you taught me, master." Their bodies began to shake violently, chairs crashing over, silverware scattering. Caleb clawed at the table, dragging himself an inch before collapsing. Jeremiah's eyes rolled back white. Nathaniel's breath came in short, ragged bursts. Maria moved slowly around the table, collecting fallen napkins, setting them aside neatly. She looked each man in the face one by one. "To you, Edmund Thornwood," she said softly, "for the whip and the brand. To you, Nathaniel, for the lash on my daughters' backs. To you, Jeremiah, for the blood at the gin. And to you, Caleb," she whispered, her voice low and cold, "for every scream in the night." When the last twitch left their limbs, she turned toward the kitchen. The cauldrons were ready, 4 of them, heavy and waiting, the fat bubbling thick and alive. She worked without haste, humming the same soft tune she had sung to her children years ago. She dragged each man's body, one at a time, from the dining room to the kitchen. They were heavy, but she was stronger than anyone had ever known. Her arms shook, her back burned, but she kept going. When Edmund's corpse hit the brick floor beside the first cauldron, she paused to wipe the sweat from her brow. "You wanted to be remembered, master," she murmured. Now you will be. She lifted the long iron hook used for meat and set it against his coat. The flesh hissed when it touched the boiling lard. The smell that filled the air was unlike anything human should know. Sweet, greasy, horrifying. She did the same with the others. One by one, no haste, no mercy. When she was done, she sat beside the fire, watching the fat bubble and spit. Her breath came slow. Her eyes were calm. The kitchen glowed red around her, walls slick with heat, shadows trembling. Outside, snow began to fall. Inside, fire ate through everything that had ever been Thornwood's pride. Maria poured herself a cup of Edmund's brandy, raised it in silence, and drank. Then she took the bottle of laudanum from her apron pocket, unstoppered it, and drank that too. By the time the first light of Christmas touched the horizon, Maria Thornwood, the cook, the widow, the woman who had been Aomide, was dead. Her body sat upright in her chair, head tilted toward the fire, eyes half closed, a faint smile on her lips, and in the kitchen of Thornwood Plantation, the cauldrons of fire still boiled, hissing like judgment fulfilled. The frost had returned by the time the first light reached the fields. The air was bitter and silent, too silent. The kind of silence that hangs after something holy or unspeakable has happened, and no creature knows which it was. Harlan, the overseer, was the first to rise. He stepped out of his cabin, rubbing his arms against the cold, confused that no smoke came from the big house chimney. On Christmas morning, it was usually alive by dawn, fires blazing, servants rushing, the smell of coffee and roasted meat drifting across the yard, but now the air smelled strange, sweet, heavy and wrong. He followed it toward the kitchen house, boots crunching on frozen dirt. As he neared, he saw that the door was open. The frost around the threshold had melted into slick mud. Inside he found hell. 4 shapes lay in ruin on the brick floor, unrecognizable, the skin burned, clothing fused to flesh. The cauldron still hissed, half full of bubbling grease that shimmered like molten gold. The stench was unbearable, thick enough to make him gag. Maria sat a few feet away in her chair, arms crossed loosely in her lap, head tilted as if listening to music only she could hear. The bottle of laudanum rested by her feet, the label peeling away. Harlan stumbled backward into the yard and vomited into the snow. Within an hour, a rider had gone for the sheriff. By mid-morning, the plantation was crawling with white men, neighbors, deputies, and farmers from miles around, drawn by rumor. They moved through the big house whispering, crossing themselves when they saw the bodies. The county doctor arrived last. He examined the scene, frowned, and spoke in a flat, professional tone. "Poison first, fire after. She cooked them like hogs," someone spat. Someone else murmured, "The devil's woman." The sheriff looked at Maria's body, her peaceful face, the faint smile that death had not erased. "No," he said slowly, "not the devil's, just a woman who had enough." He ordered the 4 men buried together behind the house, calling it Christian decency. The bodies were wrapped in sheets and lowered into hastily dug holes. Their coffins smoked faintly from what was left of them. Maria was buried separately, without a coffin, at the edge of the field. The sheriff allowed it only because Harlan refused to touch her again. "Let the earth take her," he said. That night the remaining slaves gathered in secret. They built a small fire by her grave, hidden behind the cotton gin. Grace and Hope stood among them, silent, stunned, holding each other's hands. Old Moses spoke a few words, his voice hoarse. "The Lord may not claim her soul, but the ancestors will." She sent 4 devils back to hell. That counts for something. They sang softly then, not hymns but older songs, songs from across the ocean, low, rhythmic, made for the dark. The fire burned down to coals, and when it died, no one spoke again. By morning, soldiers from Jackson arrived to restore order. They questioned everyone, took names and wrote reports filled with half-truths and lies. The story spread fast. A mad cook murdered her masters in cold blood. That was what the newspapers called her, the Jezebel of Yazoo County. But that wasn't the story that survived. Among the enslaved, her name became something else. They called her Mama Fire, the Iron Cook, the Widow Thornwood. The tale moved from Mississippi to Louisiana, from plantation to plantation, growing sharper each time. Mothers whispered it to their daughters, "Be careful, but never forget, one of us made them burn." Years later, when Union troops marched through Mississippi, and the Thornwood ruins lay covered in weeds. Some soldiers said they heard voices at night near the old kitchen house, soft singing, the sound of bubbling grease, the faint rhythm of a woman's footsteps on brick. No one dared to enter after dark. Grace and Hope lived to see freedom. They never spoke of their mother again, not in public. But Grace kept a small piece of cloth hidden her whole life, a scrap from Maria's old apron, folded and wrapped in oilskin. When she died, her granddaughter found it and asked what it was. She was the one who ended Thornwood, Grace said simply. Remember that and don't ever let them tell you she was crazy. The granddaughter nodded. She would tell her own children one day, and so the story stayed alive, not written in books, but carried in the mouths of those who needed it most. Maria's body turned to dust, her name to legend, but her fire never went out. A century passed. The cotton fields swallowed Thornwood whole. What was once the grandest plantation in Yazoo County became a ruin buried in vines and silence. The big house collapsed on itself in a storm around 1912. The brick kitchen stood longest, its chimney blackened, its floor still stained, but by the 1940s even that was gone, swallowed by weeds and time, yet her story never died. At first it lived only in whispers. Among freed people and their children, the name Maria the Cook was spoken carefully, almost sacred. To some she was a warning, proof of what despair could do. To others she was justice itself, the ghost of balance finally restored. Old men sitting outside churches told her tale on hot evenings, saying, "You think God didn't see? He sent her." Women told it differently, softer. She cooked and she waited, and when her day came she did not miss. Every version changed a little. In one, she burned the men alive while singing an African hymn. In another, she stood untouched by the flames. In some, she vanished before the sheriff arrived, walking straight into the swamp where no white man dared follow. Truth blurred into myth, but the heart of it never changed. A woman who had been powerless found a way to make the world tremble. When emancipation came, Grace and Hope were grown women. They never saw each other again, but both carried their mother's story. Grace stayed in Mississippi, working as a cook in a white household that never knew her lineage. Hope moved west, joined a church in New Orleans, and raised 3 children. Each daughter told their version when it was safe, careful to keep the names hidden, but the meaning clear. We come from a woman who made the fire answer her. By the 1930s, the story surfaced in the folklore studies of the WPA. A field researcher named Jacob Harlan, a grandson of the overseer, interviewed elderly black residents of Yazoo County. They told him about Mama Fire, the cook who boiled her masters and smiled while they screamed. He dismissed it as a vivid local superstition. His notes gathered dust in a university basement. In the 1960s, during the civil rights movement, the tale resurfaced again. Activists in Jackson painted her name on protest signs. Remember Maria. College students recited her story in basements and backyards, calling her the first freedom fighter of the Delta. Historians debated whether she existed at all. The courthouse records from 1847 listed the Thornwoods' deaths as accidental fire. No record of Maria's burial, no mention of poison, no witnesses. But local memory doesn't rely on ink and paper. It remembers in breath, in song, in fear and pride. In the 1990s, archaeologists from the University of Mississippi excavated the Thornwood site. Beneath layers of ash and brick, they found 4 charred iron cauldrons. Near one corner of the ruin, they uncovered fragments of glass from an old laudanum bottle, and a small iron spoon fused to the floor by heat. They found no body. One of the researchers, a Nigerian-American woman named Dr. Adebayo, recognized something the others missed. The hearthstones were arranged in a pattern, crossed lines surrounded by a circle. "That's not European," she said quietly. "That's Ogun's mark, the god of iron." Her paper was dismissed as interpretive speculation. Still, she kept the cauldron fragments in her university office, labeled unidentified 1840s kitchenware. In Yazoo County today, nothing remains of Thornwood but wild grass and uneven ground. Locals say on winter nights, you can still smell something sweet and burnt when the wind turns east. Some swear they see a woman walking the fields, head high, skirt brushing frost, her hands black with soot. Children are told not to go near the old grounds after dark. "Mama Fire will catch you," their elders warn. But those same elders, when alone, whisper something different. She doesn't burn children. She burns masters. In the end, Maria's story became larger than revenge. It became a parable of balance, of what happens when cruelty meets patience, when silence turns to action. History tried to erase her, but legend rebuilt her stronger. Not a saint, not a monster. Just a woman who decided the scales had stayed crooked long enough. And if you stand in those fields at dawn, where the frost meets the ash, you might still feel it, the echo of her fire, the hum of her song, and the quiet certainty that justice, no matter how long it waits, remembers the way home.